Yes, Jimmy Johnny, microphone number 14.
Machincho, Kankeme So San, Tai Chung Triando Teneje, Agency, Tangichu DC. Leader, government leader, Tati, Tanae, Ujenke, Tan, Jandananka City, Hotado, Todetso, Hotarachong, Tegechong, Wani, Yatalawa, Lataje, Chokia, Hotado, Tandunia, Dan Kagedo, is it Hotadan. Tantangia, and a clear, is a car, Hotado, Nitaji, Tinakia, Hujia, Makaya, Hotado. Somto Hujinga, Somto Adu, Tanyete Jia, Tantoni a clear, a jong, Chu Jong, Clianto, Natsati. Tako, to see, Chuni, Natsati. To us, yesterday, Sikayete Honi. Yeah, Kuchan Sado, Tade Jack the Hote, Motia de Clear, the one seat at Jantan. We are Satara, the Yako Yete, Huchi Chong, Mok Chung, we say, Truck, the Chok. Kia Di Tot is a theatre artist. Kuchan yeah. Mining Yuhusi is a raw city. To the sea, Yetsi. Mining there. Gas and oil from to Yeti there, Yeti. Somdo adjutant there, Yada there. The one see, then done city, Tane air. Then see the Nankayete. The dunia Cliento Yohuni. The dunia the Nanka Kitano Te Yenang. Utenya Te. It's something. He's saying honey. That talk is saying honey. Hoda Zoti, he's saying. Cliento Hoda Zoti. It's a guy. Sosan Tankeninche. The Dunya Senya and Senga Clyde, Klatok, Huni, Tanankaya, Huni, Shokia, Huni, Tanyana, Huni, Chuni, Chongia, Huni. Sansi, a junk says, see who needs his son. Honey, Jung. Yes, Ben. He's only that clock. He's here. Jane a to honey, Jane. Sahaji. Utangi, June, Senya. Sanchung is here. A junction. Senati. The kid citizen. Kutanda kitty uni. Big words from Kutanda uni to do this. What I said is, we are people of this land. And you all know that from the United States right up to NW2, that's all First Nation land. Our trails are all over that. We've traveled far and wide. This is First Nation country. That's what I've been saying for a long time too. This is the land of our first people here. When I spoke my language, it was long, but in English, it's going to be short. And I said that when the white people came up, they were hungry, they were starving. We as First Nation hunted for them, fed them. And as they keep coming, they introduce mining, gas and oil, and start spoiling the country, the water, polluting the water. We don't want that no more. Well, I don't want it anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I'm talking very, very protectively about Peel River watershed, because there's people living down, and the government want to put mining activity, gas and oil activity, where they're going to pollute the water, and all the people are going to be sick. And one of the elders up there at Fort McPherson told me, she's an elderly lady, she said, Jimmy, keep talking, keep fighting. Help us protect the Peel River. I still want to fish, and I still want my grandchildren to fish there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Jimmy Johnny, for those comments. So perhaps what I could do is lead off and ask the first question, give you a bit of a backdrop. We did have time to sort of toss around some ideas. So the first question deals with PSTAs. We know that the Yukon receives in excess of $1 billion a year from Canada under their FTA, and But Yukon First Nations historically have had no input or say with respect to either the amount or how the proceeds are spent. So the question becomes, I guess, twofold. One is, to date, there have been no territorial funds for PSTAs under Section 17 of the Agreements for Self-Government. So the question is, how would you involve Yukon First Nation chiefs in the development of the annual territorial budget? Question one. And two, how do we establish joint priorities as a part of that? And question three, how do we collectively promote fiscal development jointly in that regard? So that's the theme and thrust of the first question. So who wants to tackle that? How about we start to my left here? Yukon Party. Okay, to my immediate left.
Well, thank you, and good morning again. So three parts to the question. The territorial formula financing is an agreement that dates back to Eric Nielsen, when Eric was the Member of Parliament and subsequently the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. And Eric actually helped put this together, which has really helped ensure that Yukon is able to provide the programs and services similar to other parts of the country at what they describe at similar rates of taxation. Now, that formula is not static. What happened is back in the 90s, for example, when the federal government had huge deficits, the government at that time, Prime Minister Chrétien and Finance Minister Paul Martin, made some significant cuts to funding to provinces and to territories, and they balanced their budget by making cuts to the provinces and territories. And we saw consequences of that across the country for decades. For example, the shortage of doctors, the shortage of nurses, because part of that funding helped to the provinces have spots for doctors and nurses at university. So there is nothing that's guaranteed when it comes to that funding, and we saw it again this year in December when the government again in Ottawa said, we're not going to give you the amount of money that you should get based on the formula that is in place. Now, that's a formula that talks. A couple of the principles of that formula is predictability and stability. So after a bunch of discussions, we negotiated that from a reduction from what we were to receive. They announced originally $23 million less than what we were supposed to get. We got that back, so we were only shorted $6.5 million. But I think what I'm talking to is that the unpredictability of what that funding is, and the fact that as a government in Yukon that is here and its only focus is Yukoners. That's our focus. We're not affiliated with the other parties that in Ottawa. So we made a lot of noise. We worked together with the other two Northern Territories, and we did see some of that money come back. Now, that money comes to the territory, and we go through a budget process. All the parties debate that budget, and prior to it being tabled, as we did again this year, we toured around. We're listening to Yukoners. All of the MLAs are also listening to Yukoners. And I guess I don't know where this is going to evolve over time. And as I mentioned in my comments, that there is no map for us. We're leading the way. So what I see is continuous growth in how we work together to achieve success, prosperity for all Yukoners. And that's what my concern and my goal is. Right now, we have representatives who are elected in 19 different ridings. And those representatives have an opportunity and really have it's part of their job is to listen to the people within their riding. And so I'm very proud of the team that we have, and I'm excited about some of the candidates who have stepped forward for us, who represent First Nations as well, such as Darius. We have Geraldine Van Bibber will be seeking the nomination for us in Porter Creek, and Corey Belmore, who will be seeking the nomination in Mayo Tatchin as well. I think there's lots of opportunities to provide input into that, and part of that also is direct conversations, bilateral conversations between the government, between the elected officials such as myself and with chiefs. I think there's a lot of different ways. I don't know how it'll end and how it will evolve over time. I see us moving closer to being more harmonized in the effort of getting the best value for our money. So to that, I have been a strong advocate for First Nations on things like the financial transfer agreement. Now that is an agreement, a negotiation between individual self-governing First Nations and Government of Canada. But the importance of this is profound for our territory. It is a huge amount of money that comes into the territory that helps support our growing economy. So I very much, while the Yukon government's not a part of those negotiations, to let the government and the Prime Minister know that trying to implement a formula when it comes to FTA agreements really is taking steps backwards and is more related to the Indian Act than to the progressive, modern intent of what the self-governing agreements are. So I know that there's been a lot of talk about infrastructure dollars as well, and we certainly have supported that position, telling Canada that we'd like to see additional dollars, and there is capacity within First Nations to be able to build upon and invest in infrastructure directly. Now when we take money given by when we get money for infrastructure, we focus primarily on things that benefit all members of all Yukoners, like clean water, wastewater, roads and bridges, and I think that is very important, and we support additional dollars coming forward. So you want me to stop, that's what you're saying? Okay.
Well, thank you. So I'll now ask Ms. Hanson to speak to those three questions, and I'll hang on to my mic because I don't want to give up my power to you guys.
All right, Dave, I would like to see you relinquish power. I think the question you started off asking was with respect to program service transfer agreements, but then as it morphed into the 3 points, I think what you're asking goes at the crux of what I was saying in my comments this morning. The Yukon government, as representing all 36,000 or so, depending on the day, Yukoners, receives over $1 billion from Canada. Yukon First Nations, as governments, through the financial transfer agreements, also are in receipt of revenues from the Government of Canada. One of the challenges, as I was saying this morning, in my view, and I put this out as a challenge to us all, is that we come to the table with our histories. First Nations, having endured the legacy of the Indian Act and Indian Act bans, have grown into fully self-governing First Nations. The Yukon government also had a colonial relationship with the Government of Canada, where the Government of Canada made all the decisions about what occurred in this territory. And what we need now, in my view, is to go the next step, is to talk together about how we jointly, as First Nations governments, as the Government of Yukon, go forward in talking about how, with respect to our government structures, our decision-making processes, we are going to collectively make decisions that will benefit the Yukon now and into the future. So in my conversations, we didn't just start going out to have consultations with communities, with First Nations leadership this last year. Since we were elected in 2011, myself and my colleagues in the NDP official opposition caucus have made a regular habit of being out in the communities, listening to people. And I've thrown out ideas. And so with some chiefs and councils, I have said, what about the idea of the Government of Yukon and First Nations leadership coming to the table and saying, what are our priorities? What do I bring to the table as the Government of Yukon in terms of the financial resources that I have? And what do you bring to the table? And then jointly, how will we make the decisions with respect to the priorities that we have? And I said this morning that we have amazing tools because we have a self-governing agreement which is enabling. Yes, there is the provision to negotiate program service transfer agreements. But I challenge you, do we really want to see 15 different levels or 15 different kinds of health and social service programs in this territory? Can we collectively afford that? Or do we think that there are some common needs? I was just talking to somebody over in the tent about the incidence of diabetes in the territory, the increase in diabetes, the resulting increase for the need for dialysis. We have no dialysis unit in this territory, and partly because we don't have a common way of addressing and identifying the need. I think together as governments we can do that. So I think it's really important that we both be open, both levels of government, to having that frank and mature conversation about how we achieve those priorities. It puts a lot of pressure on First Nations leadership from their citizens to represent those interests at a common table, puts a significant amount of pressure on the Government of Yukon, the Premier. I think that in terms of that, when we look at that fiscal jointly, then we talked about how we jointly manage the fiscal resources of the Yukon government. That's a starting point. We have the tools, we have the Yukon Forum, and we also, Mr. Silver this morning talked about changing and reviewing the processes within the Legislative Assembly. The NDP has had on the record for the last 5, 8, well, prior to me, Todd Hardy, a whole suite of democratic reform provisions that we have put forward to change up how we work within the Legislative Assembly and to reach out. I just want one other comment, if I may, is that there was a time when the CYFN leadership, and I can remember there was a suggestion that we would look at how we would develop a common legislative fora where there would be Yukon First Nations leaders and the cabinet and meeting together in a common room. You know, people look at the Legislative Assembly building. That was built under the colonial relationship in 1976 when we were just an administrative arm of the Government of Canada. Maybe it's time to begin to think about building and looking at our own Legislative Assembly where we come together to make some of these decisions together. So I'm throwing out some ideas that these are ideas that within our caucus we have talked about within our membership and amongst some of the people in this room we've discussed. But I think the key thing is that it's not no longer, I don't think, possible to say that we operate in silos. Our governments are inextricably linked, and we have to work together to develop those priorities financially.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Silver.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joe. This is a hard question to answer because of two reasons. One, it's a limited amount of time, and two, it's not a dialogue. It's is us communicating as leaders, basically what we've either implemented or what we've heard. And, you know, for me, the individual issues that every community is working on aren't that different. You know, the specifics are different. You know, Chief McGinty and I talked about lagoons in his community, or, you know, Chief Fairclough talking about water and security there. Also talking with Chief Joseph about Kamenak and resource roads, this types of things. Everybody's working along on logical next steps in their communities. And as I go out and talk to municipalities and go out and talk to chief and councils, I am absolutely amazed at the fact that there's no limit of good ideas. There's no limit of good ideas. And if you take a look at self-governing First Nations drawing down, we're talking exponential growth in the last 20 years. The problem isn't with the growth in the First Nations governments either. The communication is there. Look at these tables. Look at the conversations that we have here when we get together as chiefs and councils. Look at your leadership meetings. I'm sure there's lots of hard conversations, but the problem is not in the First Nations communities and the development therein. They're working. I'm seeing it in Toronto-Cochin again. Citizens that I taught coming back with master's degrees to work in their government. And that is just such an amazing, as an educator, what an amazing experience it is to be able to be part of that and to watch, like I said, that exponential growth. The problem here is with the territorial government. We do build up silos in the territorial government, and I'm not going to blame the current government for that. I'm going to say that the government in all different political past incarnations has done that. We work in silos. The Department of Education doesn't talk to the Department of Community Services, or Health and Social Services, or Tourism and Culture. And we work away very diligently on our individual files, but we need to increase our own communication within our departments, first and foremost. So we need to lead by changing how we do business, first and foremost. The question started with joint priorities. Well, that's the first thing we need to do. We can't point fingers. We need to be able to lead by example therein. And if we have better communication, there's a great concept out there in education called the whole child. And that is basically, don't look at the school as a building. You got to look at the school as a collaborative effect of individuals in the community talking about bettering ourselves and educating ourselves, not just students, but as lifelong learners, the teachers as well, and the administrators, and the community as a whole. And when you have a whole child, when you have the approach of being a lifelong learner, or if you have a government that talks about the whole child, education can't stop at 3:30 and say our hands are tied. We're now done. And then you look to social services and they say, oh, well, you know, we can't pick up here and we can't communicate. These boundaries have to change, and we need to do better ourselves internally as a government. When I look at going down to mineral roundup or going to PDAC, wouldn't it be great as well if the Yukon could show a united voice to go down together, government to government, and let the industry know where we're open for business and where we're not open for business. Those are very important things that we can do government to government. But again, all of these ideas, that they're not coming directly from me. These are ideas that I heard from you. You know, when I go out to tour communities and listen to leadership and listen to citizens, these are your ideas. And the challenge that's put upon the three leaders here, how do you implement that? And we have some great ideas as far as implementation. I would like to see more dialogue. Everything comes down to more dialogue. Education comes from communication, hard conversations. The Yukon Forum is legislated to be meeting 4 times a year. That's the starting point. I talked a bit in my opening comments about the leader, the premier, being able to appear at your leadership tables. I think that's very important as well. It's going to be hard dialogue, but it's dialogue we're not necessarily having right now. What we've also noticed too is
Your time's almost up.
Yeah, I'll do one more little statement. In the community tours, we're hearing about the infrastructure, we're hearing about the issues, the things that the communities want, and then we're listening to the ministers in Ottawa, and it's not necessarily what they're hearing. So we need everybody to get in the same room, and the communities need to tell the administration in the Yukon territorial government what the priorities are in a more public forum, whether that be in the Yukon Forum or in the Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, Mr. Silver. So the chair would recognize Dwayne Coyne. So in terms of answering the questions, it's obvious that I have to impose a time constraint. 3 minutes each, please, in responding. And Dwayne, I assume you're going to ask your question short and succinct. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. You going to charge us for that opinion, Dave, or? Okay. Masiedi, let get you on your gates so you satini, Gastant Kakashnuk, you had to a souk, sling it hinach. Goach na hat city an yedi, I hat lake kayadika de shitan dat hunt I hat. Detlis and Kwan I hat. Arklangle Chish, Little Salmon Carmax, for hosting us here today. I just want to apologize for my auntie and I. We didn't show up till yesterday. We too, our clan had a funeral in Teslin on Monday, so it was very difficult and very exhausting. So that's why we couldn't show up till last night. So, and our prayers and thoughts also go out to the family of Clyde Blackjack, and for all peoples here who experience loss. I think we've all experienced loss a lot this year and over the last little while, so take care. So my question is, I see all these salmon, these wooden salmon around the table, and salmon is so important to all our people, and the salmon stocks have been declining drastically over the last few years, and we've all been doing our own ways of conserving and fighting to save our salmon, our Yukon River salmon. But it concerns us seeing the next generation hydro, that most of their proposed sites are on the Yukon River watershed. And one of them was on the Teslin River. One of the proposed sites was on the Teslin River. Teslin-Clinka Council at our GA last year strongly opposed the Teslin River dam site. And because it would have flooded 2 Category A blocks, that required our consent. And we strongly said no, we do not consent to a dam on the Teslin River that would flood our Category A lands. So one of my questions is that why the focus on a large reservoir hydro dam? Why not? What other alternatives would you propose to bring extra power to the Yukon other than a large reservoir hydro dam? And one of my elders asked me to ask a question as well, and it's about medical and health services, how they all seem to be funneled to Whitehorse. Us in the communities are always told, you got to go to Whitehorse for this, you got to go to Whitehorse for that. And even when we do go to Whitehorse, there's not enough beds at the hospital. So once we get to Whitehorse, the services are limited as well. A lot of our elders are forced to move from the communities to go to Whitehorse, to be away from their home, be away from their family. There needs to be more services developed within the communities so that our people can stay in the communities, especially our elders. So what would you propose to deal with that issue as well? Glenchish.
Okay, thank you, Dwayne. I'll start with Ms. Henson on this.
Thank you very much for the question, Dwayne. With respect to the question of next generation hydro, whereas the NDP believes that massive hydro development is an example of the kind of development of the past. We've seen in the United States the decommissioning of massive hydro dams, and we don't believe that there is a need to be doing that. The costs, for example, for one instance, are incredibly prohibitive. Not just the costs environmentally, but the costs financially. There are, just want to step back a second, when those provisions were negotiated over 20 years ago in the First Nation final agreements, I don't think that any of us anticipated the rapid growth in the renewable resource sector in terms of addressing our energy requirements. We have now seen that this is the fastest growth sector in the world in terms of energy. And so we have, and in this territory, we're seeing examples of Yukon First Nations taking leadership roles in developing small, appropriate, and scalable renewable energy sources for their communities. And we think that, again, for the territory, that's the area, that's the focus that we need to take. So we're not, the notion of a massive hydro dam is not something that's a priority for the Yukon NDP. With respect to medical services, this is a complex issue. We've got over the last 14 years, I think we've seen the building of what in some circles is called, it's almost like you create a crisis and then you say this is the only solution. So we have a healthcare crisis in many ways in the Yukon, and the only solution with respect to how we look after our seniors and elders has been that we should be building a massive 300-bed facility in Whitehorse. We have many seniors who are occupying acute care hospital beds in Whitehorse because we haven't provided them with the necessary supports to stay in their own home, in their own communities. We know, based on the evidence, healthcare evidence across this country, that it is less expensive and it's more healthy to allow somebody to stay in their own home, in their own community, than to try to put them into acute care facilities or into massive long-term care facilities. We will always need some continuing care, but we've got other alternatives that we need to be working on. So we don't believe that elders should be forced to move anywhere, but we do need to look at how we together figure out ways that we can keep people in their communities.
All right. Mr. Silver?
Thank you, Dwayne, for the question. On next generation hydro, lots and lots of money has been spent going down a road which in the end formulated 6 projects, and I don't know if all of them, but the majority of them are proposing massive changes to the environment on traditional territories that were not necessarily consulted with. And you know, there's a couple of different projects there that for years we've known that the First Nations in the area and the traditional territories were totally against these specific projects. So the scale is one thing, and also just the process in which we whittled down from, you know, a large list down to the Sweet 16, down to the final 6, very problematic in my opinion. We now do have net metering. We have the IPP in place. We have everything from windmills to the Yukon Ditch in Klondike County to smaller hydro projects, all of which are next generation energy issues that should be dealt with in partnership with First Nations economic development branches and leadership. Geothermal down in Liard. I mean, there's just so many great opportunities, and there's also lots of money coming from Ottawa for those places that want to spend a focused lens on the environment and the economy. And I think that these are main projects that we can actually work together with to make sure that we maximize the funding that is going to come from the nation in those pursuits. When it comes to, as well, your question about health, I couldn't agree more, Dwayne. Mental health is a huge issue in the communities. We have detox in the new hospital in Dawson, but then after detox, what happens? There's nothing. You go right back into the situation that brought you to detox. We had a golden opportunity with the building of the 2 hospitals in the rural communities to do what the Peachy report told us to do, which is we need collaborative care. And collaborative care is not waiting until you get sick. Collaborative care is using all of our healthcare providers, our medical community, our education community, our elders, everybody to teach and practice health as opposed to wait until you're sick. And I think that that's one of the issues there. We need to have a more focused lens on on continuing care, yes, that's absolute, but I do agree with Ms. Hanson. That 300 number, that came from the needs of all Yukon, not just Whitehorse. So I think we're told that it has to be 300 because this is a cost-saving method. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. I think with a collaborative care model of dealing with health as opposed to dealing with sickness, we will save a lot of money in the long run. By dealing with mental health issues in rural and also in Whitehorse, better than $1 million for a mental health strategy with no long-term planning after that. I think that we have a golden opportunity here to work together for healthcare in our communities, hand in hand with our educators and leaders. Thanks, David.
All right. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you sticking to the 3-minute time frame. Mr. Pazlowski.
Okay, thank you. So 50 years ago, there was a lot of really wise people who looked at the opportunity to say to Ottawa, give us the money to build some small dams so that we don't have to create power in all these communities with diesel. And it has truly become a legacy for this territory, where right now, if you look at the electricity that we consume, 95% of it comes from renewable, from hydroelectricity. I look at Alberta, whose goal is to reach 30% by 2030. So when we talk about building a new dam, we talk about a vision for the long term, so that as economies grow, and it takes time to develop energy projects, what you'll end up with is resorting back to more diesel or using more LNG because you don't have the capacity to be able to have that renewable energy. This is a vision that will take us and support the growth of this territory for generations to come. But it needs to be done together. We need to be able to partner. We need to find the right location. And when we do, there will be a tremendous opportunity for those First Nations who are involved to see an opportunity to create a guaranteed revenue stream as well for generations as being a partner in such an endeavor. Because when we do have more power, we can look at converting people from their home heating fuel to electricity. We can continue to make a difference and do our share in reducing greenhouse gases. And as we move forward, technologies continue to change, so that the ability to create hydro with the least amount of impact becomes more achievable all the time. And as we've heard, our government, my government, has created a microgen policy, has created an independent power producing policy, has created a biomass strategy, is working with geothermal. Because we can't say that at this point the technology is not there for renewables to be able to the other ones, the solar, the wind, are not there when it's dark and the wind doesn't blow. So I think that there is a great opportunity to work together and address the future prosperity for the territory. On the healthcare, we don't have enough beds in the hospital right now because we have, on any given day, 20 beds filled with people waiting for long-term care. Now, I have been fighting to build a nursing home for a while. We've gone through all the feasibility studies and the business case, and we're building this. And we know, we've heard from the doctors at how tight things are. Now, I can say that these other two parties will make it longer. It's because they both support either stop canceling this project or changing it. And they, in fact, have candidates who have signed a petition calling for the immediate stop work of this project. We need to be able to build a facility that looks after people that need 24/7 care. But we're also continuing to invest more money into home care in not just Whitehorse, but in all the communities as well. And as a pharmacist, we're all committed to a team-based approach to healthcare.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have time for one more question from the floor. So does anyone want to pose that question? Chief McGinty. 'Cause, 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 'cause Microphone number 5.
All right. I'd just like to thank the party leaders for showing up here today. I know it's not an easy thing to do, and it may be kind of intimidating coming to a forum of, various governments here in place. And so I guess my question would be is, once the election is called and we're anticipating in the fall, going forward, anticipating that you will be the next government in place, the next premier, what is your proposal? I guess this is kind of my question would probably fit in with a lot of the discussions about how do you involve First Nations in your government? How do we move forward on the First Nations relations? So the question is, what is your proposal for including First Nations in your policy making within your government?
So we'll start with Mr. Silver.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief McGuinty. And I want to thank you as well for the time that you gave me. We showed up in Pelly unannounced, basically, and Chief McGuinty and his wife were more than gracious in answering our questions and having dialogue. So thank you very much for that. Next time I'll book an appointment. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and we've have a lot of times. This is a problem. I'll just let you know right here. It's a good problem to have, but a lot of First Nations are working in First Nations governments. And over the last 5 years as a leader, what I've been trying to do is say, hey, we need you working in our government. We don't necessarily just only need you as candidates, but we need you as the think tank. And I've been very privileged to hear from folks that were previous Liberals about how we as a party messed that up in the past. There was a time where we presented to our Aboriginal colleagues, hey, here's our plan. Here's a great Aboriginal engagement plan. What do you think? And what was responded was, even if these are the best words possible, you didn't involve us to begin with, so it's wrong. It's fundamentally flawed to begin with. So it comes with dialogue. It comes with not having all the answers already, and it comes with a party that allows that conversation to flow. And I think what we have as an advantage as Liberals is we accept people also from the left and the right of that political sphere as well. You can't draw a Yukoner because we come from so many different backgrounds, but I tell you, there's a common goal, there's a common bond. And I think all Yukoners are they share more than they actually disagree on. And if we can work forward on common goals, then we will be the party for Yukoners. And to do that, it includes dialogue. So what we've been doing, Kevin, is we've been trying our best to make sure that we have that dialogue there. We've already talked to the chiefs, and we said we want you to help us with our policy and with our platform. And we've been developing those connections and using those friendships that over the last 5 years to make sure that the individuals that are writing down the policy that we speak of in the Legislative Assembly, that's not coming from just Liberals. That's coming from the population in general. And it is harder with the Aboriginal community because there's so many busy people working in self-governing First Nations. We have to break a mold and be more welcoming on the territorial basis for that input. Absolutely.
All right, Mr. Pazlowski.
Thank you. Again, I guess I would start with part of what I said earlier, and that is that in the 5 years I've learned a lot, and I would admit that I would do some things differently. That in the first at the beginning of the mandate there was a lot to learn, and I have actually drawn upon people from this table or people who used to be at this table to help me become a better leader, and. I believe that our party and myself as a leader has that experience now. And we will engage, and we do engage with First Nations when it comes to legislation and regulations. There is many reasons to consult with First Nations. Some of them are mandated, some of them are legal, some of them are just because it's good policy to do it. And that is the commitment that we'll make. On top of that, it's always the opportunity for an open door a phone call, a coffee, a bilateral formal agreement. Those are all ways that leaders can get together when there is concerns about what the officials are working on. But I think it's important to recognize that that consultation goes on every day. And in fact, what I hear from people is that there's so much consultation that it really becomes difficult because governments are small and there's just so many things that are going on. And that's why I support the negotiations on an enhanced FTA to be able to ensure that that there is the ability to implement the agreements that were signed. As I mentioned, it's easy to make promises, and promises are just words. And to be able to say that we can solve all the problems and we can work everything out every time, I think we all know better than that. But I think we need to be able to roll up our sleeves and we can find the way forward. Because you know we cannot sit here and say that we support everything, because then it's very difficult. People, Yukoners, First Nations also are looking for leadership and looking for people to accomplish the goals, the priorities that they set, and essentially do what they said they were going to do.
All right, thank you. Ms. Hanson.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chief McGuinty, for the question. I think that there is a couple of aspects to the question that you raise with respect to how do we involve First Nations and First Nations leadership, including with respect to policy making. The first aspect goes back to what I really do firmly believe is that the political direction comes from leadership. So it's joint leadership between First Nations leadership and the Yukon government. If we have agreement and we can agree on what the priorities and what outcomes we're looking for, then we have the responsibility to establish the culture within our own organizations that we expect our officials to deliver on those outcomes. We need to begin to create a culture of expectation that there will be deliverables, there will be measurable outcomes when we start talking about those things that affect everybody, everyday life, for our children, for our families, for our elders. I used the example in my own mind when you raised that question. It came to me was, you know, we had a golden opportunity in the mid-2000s with respect to rethinking the whole aspect of how we deal with children and families in stress in this community, in the Yukon. We have incorporated a child welfare system that was very much like the child welfare system across this country. And I think that there was incredible goodwill amongst First Nations leadership, and initially I think on the Yukon government, that we could do it differently up here. But my observation was that the Yukon government didn't have the courage to say, we will really do it differently up here, and we will try to and really incorporate the family values, culture and traditions of First Nations as we look at how we look at child and family services. So I think that it got to have the commitment and the desire, I guess, to ensure that that cultural change is not just within the leadership, but it's also within the public service for both governments, First Nation and non-First Nation. So it's working on the building on the existing mechanisms that we have with a leadership that's committed to demonstrating that change is not just words, but it's outcome.
All right, thank you very much for that. I feel like a bit of a ref at the World Cup soccer game, watching my clock here, going, how much more time should I give them, that Iceland team? Anyways, I've been lobbied for one more question, so I do believe that we can allow one more question. So I'll turn it over to the host, Chief Fairclough.
All right. Seemed like everybody's down a good road of making some commitments to us. So let's see how far you'd go with this one. Governments like to sign MOUs with First Nations. good news story, press release, nice. Once you get into government after the next election, would you consider signing legally binding agreements with First Nations?
All right, we'll start off with Mr. Pazlowski with this question.
Well, thank you, Chief Fairclough. I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean by legally binding. I'll use for an example that we just really created a whole new Land Titles Act. And that Land Titles Act, with the regulations, is going to allow First Nations to put their settlement land into the Yukon Land Titles system. And this is very significant. This is, again, another example of how our government and Yukon First Nations have the ability to do things that are just not even thought of or dreamed of in other parts of the country. This will be the first place in Canada that will allow, if First Nations choose, to put their land into the Yukon Land Titles Registry, which creates enormous opportunities. Now, Kwon Dun has moved down this road. It started as an MOU, you're correct, but what we have before us now is the ability where most of their land resides within the boundaries of the city of Whitehorse. And they did that, their leadership did that on purpose to create economic opportunities to be able to lease their land, either for residential, for people to live, or for commercial reasons. And that they saw a path to prosperity to doing that. Now that is going to be coming to a reality for Kwon Dun. I know there's a number of other First Nations that have been working towards the creation of another land titles system. And I think whichever way people go, this is a tremendous opportunity that helps the self-determination, helps that opportunity for prosperity for Yukon First Nations. And what we have done with the Yukon Land Titles Act and the regulations coming out is it will be open to all First Nations. So I think that's just a quick example of how legally it is. And I'm going to use Liz's example of the Child and Family Services Act that came in 2010. Well, that isn't the end-all, be-all, but certainly that's been a tremendous step forward. And when I talk to and hear what's going on in other jurisdictions, again, we're leading the country, and we are in so many ways. So I think that my last comment, because I'm going to get shut down, is that, as I mentioned, that people trying to articulate that we don't work together, there has been tremendous accomplishments that have occurred, not just on big things, but the little things that make a difference in people's lives, and that's really a huge priority for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Hanson.
Thank you, Chief Fairclough. I think when I heard your question, so I heard it as a memorandum of understanding and whether or not a memorandum of understanding should be legally binding. So in my hearing that, I hear I sense that there's a couple of different purposes that we might engage in a memorandum of understanding. We may engage in an MOU to guide a process that we want to, as governments, do together. Or we may enter into a memorandum of understanding because we jointly agree that we want to get something done. And in my view, an example of that might be a memorandum of understanding that we are finally going to deliver on successor resource legislation, that we will jointly develop new mining legislation to replace the old federal laws for mining in the Yukon. And so from my perspective, that would be one that I think we'd want to enter into a legally binding. I'm prepared to do that because I think that's an obligation that we've undertaken to do. We just haven't, the government has not delivered on it for the last 13 years. So I'm not sure if there's other examples of MOUs that you were looking at as legally binding or outcomes that you were seeking that, you know, the objective of having legally binding agreements on process might be more complex. But were you looking for a product, then I would see that as a possibility.
Thank you. I'll just start with a simple word, yes. Legally binding agreements, I think what we have to do is change the process. And, you know, without really knowing exactly which specific area you're talking about, here's an idea. Yukon Forum, leadership table, that's where the conversations are being had about what the priorities are of the First Nations governments and what it is specifically, whether we're talking education or we're talking health and social services or economic development. Then we need to use the Legislative Assembly to have a more robust conversation to allow the MLAs to come into that dialogue and talk based upon their constituents, not their party, but their constituents and what their ideas are on these topics. Wednesdays right now, we need to rethink how we do our Wednesdays in the Legislative Assembly. I won't get into that right now, but there's lots of room as far as how we could use that dialogue. And then finally, once we decide as a community, once we decide as Yukoners what these particular areas or arenas that we want to sign these binding agreements, we should use the select committees of the Legislative Assembly better. We should use these select committees to bring people in to develop more of that dialogue and the actual fine printing and the writing of these agreements. This is just an idea. It's a way of using the process that we currently use and change it and open up our eyes as to how we take a look at the institutions and the things that we do now, whether it be select committees or whether it be Wednesday's debates or the use of the Legislative Assembly to make sure that we have a fulsome conversation into these legally binding agreements. But in a word, Chief Fairclough, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, one more question, Chief Mervyn, or comment. Microphone number 15, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment. You know, just stepping in the world of make-believe just quickly. It would be nice if you three would work together, but we know that's not a reality. But you're committed leaders. It's obvious because you're here for a reason, and we like that. Well, I like that. But if you look around the table, you can see the reason why First Nations in Yukon are successful, because we work together, and it's clear. We made numerous successes that you're well aware of, but the realities of the situation is currently here in Yukon. You need to find some way to create a nucleus of good advisors, consisting of old, retired, well, not old, but but retired bureaucrats who've been through the land claims process. They're out there. And our First Nations, they're here too. There's one sitting right beside you, right there. That it's clear to us that you need this advisory board, however you call it, whatever your process, your structure would allow. And then, I mean, they'll tell you, don't go there. Don't go here. Stay away from that. And our way of thinking is that that's the way to do it. So just a word of advice, and I don't know if it's worth a dime or a penny, but there it is. Masicho, and thank you very much for your attendance.
All right, thank you very much. You know, it's hard to turn down a chief, especially Chief Joseph, so she wanted to ask a question or make a comment. Chief Joseph, microphone number 13, is it?
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to express Chondakwichin's sincerity to Little Salmon Carmack's First Nation and their elder, for their elder Clyde Blackjack, as well as to Teslin Tlingit Council on the passing of their member. Our sincere condolences to your your clan, to your community, and to your people. I'd also like to thank the party leaders for coming out this morning as well, taking the time to meet with us. I have a couple of questions. The Yukon Devolution Transfer Agreement intended to establish a partnership between the Yukon government and Yukon First Nations with respect to resource management in the Yukon. This is something that's important since we have Aboriginal and treaty rights, titles, and interests relating to Crown lands. Trundikwichin has 350 grandfather claims on the 1,000 square lands that we've negotiated in our land claims. So this is 350 grandfather claims. That land, we can't use it because it's grandfathered. And it's being occupied by residences, by people who staked a claim on that piece of Trundikwichin settlement land. A key element of the devolution transfer is the development of the new resource legislation to replace the outdated and archaic mirror legislation, regulations, and policies such as mining and land. We developed forestry legislation and oil and gas legislation in collaboration with Yukon government, but no progress has been made in the mirror legislation relating to mining or land legislation. While there are current discussions relating to mining regulation matters, the territorial mandates are limited, and any agreement with Yukon First Nations is a remote possibility. The outdated mirror legislation violates our Aboriginal and treaty rights, titles, and interests, and obstructs economic development in the Yukon. We can't piecemeal this legislation in tiny bits because it's not effective. And the out legislation, just as an example, for mining on Category A land, we received, this is how outdated the legislation is, that it's 100 years old, it pays 37.5 cents for royalties, and we received a check for mining on Category A land for $69 this year, and last year it was $36. That's a real insult to us, to our people, and to our Aboriginal treaty rights for our lands. And basically, it's not working together with the promises that were made for the devolution transfer agreement and upholding the intent and spirit of our final agreements. We've tried to work diligently with the government, but, we signed a MOU. It goes back to the question on, will you have binding agreements? We signed a MOU, and the MOU is useless. Nothing has resulted from it. We've wasted time, money, and effort from our staff and our legal assistants and our leaders around the table on numerous occasions on these issues and getting nowhere. All we've received is lip service. How would you work with Yukon First Nations to update resource legislation in the Yukon, involve Yukon First Nations in the management of land and resources on Crown lands and in the Yukon? We can't be dealing with these things in court all the time. We need to move these issues along forward and take into consideration that we have settlement lands that are being affected by these outdated legislations. The other issue that I have, that we have as Yukon First Nations, is the reason why we raised the issue on the billion-dollar budget that's coming to the Yukon is because Yukon government, through that FTA budget, is responsible for providing services, as you say, to all Yukoners, and that includes Yukon First Nations. So the Yukon government budgets money to health and social, to the Justice Department, and in the social services, health and social, out of all of the children that are taken away every single year or that are taken away permanently, 70% of those children are Yukon First Nation children. And it's just another way of developing another system of residential school for our children. The other issue is with justice. Out of all of the people who are incarcerated in the jail system, 70% of those people are Yukon First Nation people. You've taken away, you're continuing to keep us in a colonial system by continuing to take our children away from us. These are affecting our children, our family, and our people, and our communities. And there's no improvement in terms of reforming our people who are incarcerated. The programs that you're providing are not consistent with the programs that need to help them become healthy citizens in our communities, as well as you're not helping, your policies are not helping to restore our children back to our communities and to their families. It's a unilateral system and policies that keep our children in your system, and you're not working with the families to help them become so that the children can return home. You're not helping the mothers, you're not helping the fathers with the kind of policies that you have developed. These policies need to change in order to have a holistic approach on the whole welfare of the child or the person who is incarcerated. There's millions of dollars going into salaries in your departments to provide this service to our children and to our people. And it's not working out successfully. We need that changed. And we need to be a part of the policy and the money to make these changes. Thank you.
All right, we'll start with Ms. Hansen. You still have, I'm sorry, your 3 minutes.
3 minutes, and those are pretty amazing questions that you've raised, Chief Joseph. I think I've been very clear already with respect to the devolution transfer agreement and the importance on resource management, with respect to the mining legislation and new resource legislation. I spoke to Chief Fairclough and used that as the example of what I would see as the need for a legally binding MOU, because that legislation is so very out of date. I agree with you 100%. We have raised in the legislature many times over the last 5 years this whole approach to taking a piecemeal around the edges. Let's sort of talk about some of the issues around mining, but not talk about how do we have a modern mining legislation that reflects the 21st century in this territory. When placer gold is priced at 37.5 cents an ounce, fixed at a 1906 price of $35 an ounce, you're right. That's unusual. It's probably no place else in the world. We need to ensure that mining respects all the other values that we now have in this territory. cultural, traditional, residential, agriculture, commercial. The example that you used with respect to having, grandfathered claims on settlement land, I think the expectation was that when we got to the stage, we would first of all have land use plans in place 20-some years after agreements are now concluded. We have one, and one in court. We wouldn't have a situation where we would be making changes to placer legislation to allow people to not just do minorly activity on their placer claims, but to build residences and get title to that. I don't think anybody expected that when the negotiations were done. And I certainly don't think that any miner expected that that's what's going to be happening. So I think there's two parts of that. One is that with respect to completing the obligations under the Devolution Transfer Agreement, and the second with the broader question of land and resource management, those questions are able to be addressed when we together complete land use planning in this territory. First Nations, I believe, made significant compromises when land claims were completed. In return for retaining approximately 10% of the land mass in this territory, First Nations agreed that we would together develop a number of common bodies for making decisions about how land and resources would be managed in this territory, and we fundamentally agreed that we would have land use plans in place so there would be no dispute about what uses lands would be put to throughout this territory. So I think that land use planning is an absolute imperative, and we need to figure out ways jointly to get that done as quickly as possible, because the longer it's unresolved, the more there are continued disputes throughout the territory, and that harms both relationships and the economy. With respect to justice, this is a huge issue in the whole area of how we include, you talked about the territorial formula finance agreement. The justice issue is, and justice and health and child and family services are issues that we've been focusing on for the last number of years. We've got to move beyond having all these discussions about vague strategies, and we're talking about just all out in the ether. There are serious issues going on in communities with families, with kids, and with elders. There are serious issues going on at our community correctional facility. We have significant number of the people who are in that jail who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. When we requested that legislation be changed with respect to our Corrections Act so we could actually provide training and accommodate the fact that people with FASD cannot do well in that kind of environment, the government of the day rejected it. So there are concrete things that we need to do together, but we can't have one government saying this is the way it's going to be. We need to do it as government to government. I'm going to get cut off.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Silver.
Masicho, Chief Joseph, lots of powerful questions here. Not enough time in 3 minutes to answer them all. We've had conversations about all of these issues. I'll just share a few of my comments. Devolution was interesting with getting mirrored legislation out of Ottawa. What we did see as well, we did see a little bit of a drain from the communities as far as responsibility, as far as the jobs as well. And sometimes that's necessary, but other times it's just for bureaucratic ease. And we need to make sure that that the voices of the communities are heard, because when it comes to specifically with your issues on mining claims and issues with First Nations, I'll agree with Ms. Hanson that it comes down to land use planning. There used to be an antiquated way of going about business with the mining companies. A lot of the mining companies get it now, and there's certain companies that understand how to move forward. First Nations governments, your First Nations government has been leading in economic development, I think, on mining, watching how you've worked with Kaminak. When have you ever seen past adequacy, a company going into both into the ESSA process and to water board licensing at the same time? And really what you can see with the current legislation is where there's a will, there's a way, and where the respect and relationships are there, we can move forward on our economy. With First Nations leading that drive when it comes to mining, we're going to have 7 generations of jobs and not just quick fixes. So working with the correct communities, that's for sure. But like I said, there's an antiquated way of doing mining in the Yukon. And then there's a new way of doing it, and we definitely we know that the First Nations governments get it. We know that the mining companies get it, and it's time for the territorial government to change its ways as well. You know, we all know of Bill Gallagher's books on the resource rulers. We are in court right now with the appeal. Every time we go to the Supreme Court, First Nations, if it has to do with mining, if it has to do with resources, you know, it's always a win for the First Nations. It's time for our government to get out of the old ways and to come to the table and have better dialogue with all governments. And as opposed to dealing with First Nations, we need to partner with First Nations on that. Now, on the other side, with health and social services and with child care and justice, you know, there's just so much to talk about here, Chief Joseph. Not enough time today, but I will say education, education, education. That's where we win. You know, when I don't know of a university in Canada that wouldn't love for us to have a unique way of approaching our citizens here if we wanted to send people to post-secondary education. We have so much going on with governance. We have so much going on with land use planning. We are ahead of the curve. And we need to continue down that path. We need to change how we do our education system because sometimes we can't do worse. I asked the Minister of Education to provide the leaving certificate numbers for our community, for our rural kids. And that's, you cross the stage with the other graduates, but that piece of paper is not worth anything because if you want to do anything past that, you have to go back to school just to get your general equivalency. I asked for that. It was promised that we would see that in the next education report. It wasn't in that education report because the numbers are damning. They are. We're not doing enough for our Aboriginal youth in education. The recidivism in our jails right now tells us that the current approaches are not working. We have many, many hard conversations in front of us, that's for sure, and we got a lot of direction to go, but we need your leadership on that, Chief Joseph.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pazlowski.
Okay, thank you. So first off, I'm going to say that I'm going to disagree with the other two to just talk about saying land use planning is the solution because land use planning doesn't solve the issues that First Nations have identified that they have with quartz mining or placer mining. So just to come out here and say, yeah, land use planning will do it is I have to disagree with that. There are issues, and I believe that there are some things that can be done through the DTA protocol, which will provide quick wins for everyone. There are other issues that need more time. But one thing I can say very clearly that I have heard from industry very, very strongly is that now is not the time to look at successor resource legislation because they said quite clearly that they're walking away, that they will leave the territory until they know what the rules are. And I think it doesn't matter what industry it is, people just want to have certainty and know what the rules are. So as we go through a period of years to come up with successor resource legislation, the industry said we will be pulling out and we will wait to see what it is because we're not going to make massive investments in a territory knowing that the rules are changing. So that is the concern about that, and I haven't heard any response from the other two on that. I think that it is very important to me that we focus on opportunities to create jobs for families. And I think that we can do both. We need to be able to address the issues, and we do that by sitting down and talking through these things. But I want to see that opportunity. When it comes to placer mining, I look in the Klondike, in the Mayo districts at all the jobs that are created. Yes, we don't have huge royalties, but again, those on that number of ounces, those royalties would probably mean the difference between placer mining existing, at least to the level it is, or not. Now, those placer miners hire a lot of people. They create a lot of business for First Nation businesses and for all businesses. And I think that has a direct impact. And I'm going to stand here and say I will support creating opportunities for citizens and for our youth to have good paying jobs. I think that that's important. And I didn't hear about that. And education certainly is one of those opportunities, and that's why a few years ago we signed with TH on 17.7 to move ahead, and now we've seen a number of other First Nations who have engaged and are following the same suit, because education is great economic policy as well as social policy, and we are focused now on the outcomes for all students and making some great wins. Justice is a very difficult situation. I talked about the improvements that we've seen in family and child services as we, together with First Nations, created the new act in 2010. And it's not perfect yet, and we know that, but it is much better where the first focus is to keep kids with family, or at least with their communities. And I need to say that some of the great innovative stuff in justice through the Wellness Circle, some of the programming that exists at Whitehorse Corrections, again, is leading the country. One of the things that I say to people is that, every 10 years, people should have to leave the territory for 6 months, because they would see really what a great place this is. Is there more that we can do? Absolutely, we have to work together to do it. But I think that we live in an incredible territory right now that provides services that other parts of the country only dream about. So I'm very proud of the work that's done. There's more work to be done together, and I look forward to that.
Okay, thank you all very much. We are out of time, so it is. We are now concluding our 10:30 agenda items. According to my clock, it's noon hour. So I want to thank the three party leaders on behalf of the General Assembly here. I want to thank Premier Paslowski, the leader of the Yukon Party, Ms. Liz Hansen, leader of the NDP, and Mr. Sandy Silver, leader of the Yukon Liberal Party. Our history, we only got the right to vote in the Yukon territorial election in 1949, for Canada in 1960, and we will exercise that newly acquired franchise wisely, based upon your words, certainly, and the questions and your responses to the questions, but certainly not solely upon that. But thank you very much for your comments, and thank you all for your patience. Thank you, and we will now adjourn till 1:30.